reflect the presence of counsel, the defendant, and the jury. And Mr. Barker, you may proceed.
Lisa, let's go back to the beginning of your cross. I think some things were unclear. Is it your understanding that there was some demonstrative exhibit that was placed on the witness stand before you arrived?
I was made aware of that, yes.
Did you tell someone to do that?
I did not.
All right, that was done without your knowledge.
I was aware someone was going to bring something. As far as putting it on the stand, I was not aware of that.
All right, and the purpose of that was simply to be able to show the jury, here's what a cartridge looks like, here's what a bolt looks like, etc.
Yes.
Nothing nefarious, but perhaps the process of doing that was a little unusual. Is that fair?
My understanding is it was unusual, yes.
All right. Counsel pointed out a case, the Merritt case, where there was apparently some disagreement among experts in this field. That's one case in how many cases that you've done examinations?
Myself, I think I could say number of thousands of cases. And I've actually worked alongside Mr. Kalkowski. He also started in Illinois State Police. We did not train at the same time, but we received the same training and were trained by many of the same people. So I'm very familiar with his work and how he proceeds and does his work. Between the two of us, numerous thousands of cases have been done.
Would you say you've examined more than 6,000 cases?
That's
Sustained.
Well, how many, could you give us a more accurate number about how many thousands?
prior to leaving Chicago, being new, I kept record of every case I worked, just by number and types of evidence involved. And in the total of 4 years I was there, including training, I believe I'd worked close to 400 cases. We weren't not as busy in the Phoenix lab for the Arizona Department of Public Safety as I was when I worked in the Chicago lab. But over the 22 years, I think it would be safe to say over 2,000 cases, maybe even up to 5,000. If I think back to, in my mind, I'm thinking of the cases that take a little longer, but there are numerous cases that just involve a function test of a firearm, and I can get numerous of those done in one day. So 2,000 to 5,000 is probably being conservative in that guess.
All right, thank you. Now you mentioned different areas of expertise within the field of firearm examination. What type of areas are we talking about?
Serial number restoration, distance determination, crime scene reconstruction, and then different types of ballistic examinations.
And where has your focus been?
In the actual firearm and tool mark comparison work,
All right, so
comparative analysis.
microscopic work, right?
Yes.
And that was to distinguish maybe your experience from Luke Haig, who was another expert in the field, right?
Yes.
Now, counsel asked you about how much time you would spend on looking at a piece of evidence. Once you've found agreement, how many more times should you be looking at that to confirm that you found agreement in the first place?
If I find agreement to where I think it's sufficient for an identification, I may just look a little more. I may try and document with better photographs than maybe what I had taken through the beginning of my examination. If I'm starting the examination and I think there might be an area that I should focus on, I can't say how long I would take to get to a certain point, but once in my mind that I see sufficient agreement to call something an identification, the only reason I would look further is, as I stated, maybe to document better with photographs, and that would probably be it.
All right. Is it fair to say that it depends? It's a case-by-case type of thing. It's not every case is going to take the same amount of time.
That's absolutely correct.
Right. And in this case, whatever amount of time it took, you did find agreement.
I did find agreement, yes.
Counsel referred to photos, and you just mentioned that again, and how you don't have photos to show us today. We talked about this a little bit in direct, but let me ask you a different way. Would we, as untrained folks in the comparison, field be able to see the same things that you're seeing just by looking at photos?
Not necessarily, and I would not expect that you would be able to.
Counsel said that when he interviewed you, he couldn't see the comparison between the photos you had taken. Does that surprise you at all?
Given the quality that our photos typically are, and I'm not sure if that's a function of the printer we use or where they end up getting less clear, but it did not surprise me that the comment was made that the photos were not very clear.
All right. Counsel talked about if you knew something was at stake. Does it matter to you whether it's a murder case or disorderly conduct with a weapon case?
None of that matters when I'm doing my examination and making my opinions and results and conclusions.
And specifically as to this case, do you know what is, quote, at stake?
When I received the fired bullet, it apparently was in a medical examiner's type container. I can make an assumption about that. Otherwise, I don't know any more than that.
All right. At the time you made your comparison, were you aware the defendant was already arrested?
I don't think there's any reason I would have been aware of that.
All right. You're just looking in the microscope and you're calling it how you see it. Is that fair?
Yes.
You were asked about damage to the bullet. You often see damage on evidence bullets. Is that fair?
Yes.
You've examined bullets that I imagine have been through walls before and wood and metal.
Yes, many different materials and items.
And have you been able to make identifications on those cases as well?
There have been occasions, yes, that those types of bullets are identified, yes.
It's really not the damage that matters, but what you can see that's remaining. Is that right?
Exactly. What the remaining areas and the quality and quantity of information, to state it that way, that they have.
You were asked about if there's a numerical explanation, some type of numerical value, and you responded that that's not really how it works. Let me ask you if you agree with the following definition. Agreement of a combination, this is a definition of identification. Agreement of a combination of individual characteristics and all discernible class characteristics where the extent of agreement exceeds that which can occur in the comparison of tool marks made by different tools and is consistent with the agreement demonstrated by tool marks known to have been produced by the same tool. Do you agree with that definition?
Yes, I do.
Is that the AFTI definition for identification?
That's part of their definition or explanation of the AFTI theory of identification.
All right. And do you hear anything there about numerical value?
I do not.
You gave a car analogy during cross about you have a Kia out in the parking lot. There may be multiple Kias. If I understand correctly, the individual characteristics we're talking about would be like the dent on the side of the Kia that you're aware of, the sticker on the back of the window, those scratch marks that only you would know about. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes, and the way that dent was produced, the size of it, the shape of it, the scratches within it, those would be the individual things that I recognize because I did it.
Right. And over time, as a firearms examiner, when you're comparing things, you've seen these types of striations before, you've seen this type of agreement before, so the experience would matter in making those identifications, right?
I do believe so.
Now, over the years, speaking of experience, have you split your time between the time on the microscope and like crime scene or trajectory analysis?
Occasionally, we may get a distance determination case in, but primarily the majority of my time is spent doing the firearm examinations and the microscopic work that goes into the firearm identification portion.
Give us a percentage. How much time are you sitting on the bench looking through a microscope? Percentage of the time doing that as opposed to other things?
Percentage is hard to say. This year I did one distance determination case. In the process of working a function test for a firearm, I've had just a couple of serial number restorations that had to be done. Outside of that, I think it's safe to say 95% of the casework or more is specifically within firearm identification.
All right, final area you were told or talked about on cross about you're aware of an expert opinion in this case that's different from yours, right?
I am, yes.
Has that changed your opinion about the comparison you made identifying item 32 coming from item 44?
It does not.
Thank you, that's all.
Do any of the jurors have a question of this witness? Okay. Will you approach? How many test fire rounds were shot during your analysis, and how many matched the bullet in evidence?
In this case, as I typically would in others, I start with 3 test fires, and then as I was stating, I ensure that each of those 3 has sufficient reproducibility to each other, and then I'll use either 1, 2, and sometimes 3 of those test fires to compare to the fired evidence. If necessary, I could have fired additional test fires with maybe a different style bullet or just a different brand of ammunition. But in this specific case, I did the 3 that I would normally do initially. Each of those 3 identified to each other, and then the evidence bullet identified minimally to one of them. I likely had put a different one up as well. But everything was looked at in the end.
Are photos taken of the bullet or other evidence examined while under the microscope, i.e. photos taken through the microscope lens?
There is a camera connected to the comparison microscope, so the image that is taken is of what I'm viewing at the time. Again, the photograph doesn't compare to what you're seeing with the actual naked eye through the scope, but it is a representation of what I'm looking at in the area that I'm seeing at that time the photo is taken.
What specifically convinces you that you had an identification with the bullet removed from Sasha Krause's body and the rifle belonging to Mark Gooch?
I can't say that I can put the names to the items. I'm sure that they were on the packaging somewhere. Speaking of item 32, the bullet, and item 44, the rifle, after looking at the test to test, where I saw sufficient agreement that reproduced on the individual characteristics, and then looking at the evidence bullet, as stated in one of the definitions, I saw at least and more agreement than what I've seen in known identifications that I've previously seen throughout the years of my work. And it was consistent as far as the quantity and the quality of the markings that were left on that evidence bullet that I could use and line up because they reproduced from that rifle. So the quality and the quantity was there, and the reproduction was there. And in my mind, based on my training and my experience, that was sufficient for me to say those markings are the same from one to the other. Therefore, I could say that the evidence bullet was fired from the rifle that was submitted.
If a firearm has a changed part, example such as firing pin, barrel, etc., would the characteristic be the same as a non-modified firearm?
Some firearms are made where parts can be swapped out. If a barrel is replaced, then the test fire from the new barrel will be completely different than the bullet that came from the original barrel. You may as well say they're two different guns at that point when you're looking at just the bullet. If a firing pin is swapped out, in that case I would be looking at cartridge case evidence. The firing pin impression itself would be different, and I would not be able to rely on that for comparison purposes. However, the other markings that are left on the cartridge case, primarily on the primer area of that cartridge, would still be usable for comparison because the breech face of that firearm would have remained the same. It may be confusing if I actually had something along those lines submitted into the laboratory, but the parts that were not changed would still leave the same markings in the same areas, and the new parts would look maybe not completely different, but they would look different. There would be no identification made between a new part and something that was fired from the original parts. So I hope I explained that well enough. A new part will be different than the original part. Depending on what part that is, does not mean that other areas that are original cannot be used for identification purposes.
Any other questions of this witness from the jury before I turn the witness over to counsel for follow-up? All right, I don't see an indication the jurors have any more questions of the witness. Mr. Barker, any follow-up?
Just briefly, Lisa, you talked about how you made the identification in this case with item 32 and item 44. Again, you're not given a narrative of where does this come from, where does this bullet, where was it found, right?
Not necessarily. I don't recall having read anything like that in this case.
Okay, and then you made that identification. Do you always make identifications?
Oh, no.
All right. How many times do you eliminate?
I don't keep track of what my results and conclusions ever are, but I have made eliminations either based on class characteristics, and I've made eliminations based on individual characteristics in the past. And I've had plenty of inconclusive results as well.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Griffin.
Just on the question about the test fires, are those fired in sequence, or can you tell us the gap between those?
Prior to actually test firing, the cartridges that I'm going to use, I will scribe so that I know what I fired in this gun and the bullet that landed in the tank and the cartridge case that landed on the floor have the markings that I put on prior to firing. And I'll typically label them with the item number followed by A, B, and C. So I'll fire them sequentially that way. And yes, I fire them one after the other.
So within a minute, bam, bam, bam?
Recalling what type of rifle this is, I believe it was, yes, one right after the other. Again, if necessary, I could have fired additional test fires at a later time, but that was not necessary in this case.
Is there not a protocol for perhaps determining whether or not material left in the chamber could affect the striae that are found? I mean, isn't there sometimes that you could clean with a dry patch, you could clean with an oil patch? Do you not consider that?
If the firearm had been submitted and I had received stuff that was caked in dirt or oil or water, if something like that may cause a safety issue, I would clean it. With no safety issues and no excessive material of any kind on the firearm, I'll try to fire it in the condition it was received to best replicate if that actually was the firearm used. I want to make my test fires in as similar a situation as far as the condition of the gun as I can.
Can't powder and residue affect what kind of markings are left behind?
I often get firearms that come in after they've been to the latent print section. Occasionally, the firearm may need a little bit of oil now and again. That doesn't happen very often. For the most part, I've not noticed that processes such as latent prints would affect the class and individual markings that I'm looking at.
I have no further
May this witness be excused.
Yes, thank you.
You can step down, you're
Thank you.
excused. Mr. Barker? Counsel, will you approach me sidebar with Dahlia, please? All right, Mr. Griffin.
We're good to start the presentation. Call Eric Warren. Thank you.
All right, Eric Warren. Mike, thank you.
Do you solemnly swear, under penalty of perjury, the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
You already sanitized the witness stand. Thank you so much. Mr. Griffin, you may proceed when ready.
I explained to him the protocol regarding removing the mask.
Oh, thank you. Yes, yes. And then if you'll just get a little bit closer to the microphone. There we go. Thank you for your willingness to take off your mask while testifying. Thank you, Mr. Griffin. You may proceed.
Could you tell us your full name, please?
Yes, my name is Eric Warren.
All right. And Mr. Warren, what do you do for a living, sir?
So I'm self-employed as a consultant and co-owner of SEP Forensic Consultants. It's SEP Forensic Consultants.
It's, from a big picture perspective, what do you do, sir?
So my our firm consults on forensic matters for both the defense and the prosecution in state and federal and civil and military cases. Specifically, my area of expertise is firearms identification and crime scene reconstruction.
I want to go through a little bit of your background and qualifications for that type of work, all right? Tell me, let's start at the collegiate level. Do you have college degrees?
Yes, I do. So according to the guidelines of the Association of Firearm and Toolmark Examiners, which I will call AFTE, that to be a forensic scientist is a minimum of a 4-year degree in a natural or life science. So in line with that, I have my bachelor's degree in molecular and cellular biology, and I also have a doctorate degree in biochemistry and molecular biophysics, both of which from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee.
Does your doctorate work in biological sciences and biochemistry and molecular biophysics, does that help you at all in doing what you do on a daily basis these days?
Sure, it does. So biochemistry, molecular biophysics, all of these things deal with the chemistry and the physics that act internally inside of your body. And of course, that would be distantly related to what might happen when a bullet would have an impact and an effect on the body. In addition to that, and more broadly, the training to become a scientist for that doctorate teaches you basically all day long. You're eating, sleeping. When you're awake, you're thinking about the scientific method. You're designing your own experiments. You're carrying those out. You're thinking about the results in a very critical way, and then revising your experiments, revising the way that you're approaching the question or the problem at hand, and then going back and repeating some of those experiments. And that's exactly what we do in a crime laboratory or in a forensic setting when you're trying to compare multiple things to determine a common source.
So I want to move forward now. We're out of the college and PhD realm, and we're doing what you do on a day in, day out basis. Where did you start your firearms identification work?
Sure. So after I graduated and obtained my PhD, I was hired by the Tennessee State Bureau of Investigation there I was hired as a special agent forensic scientist assigned to the Firearms Identification Unit. And part of my duties in that unit were to look at evidence of a firearms-related nature, such as fired bullets, cartridge cases, other ammunition components, to try and determine, the firearm in which they were fired.
We had a witness in before you, Ms. Peloza. She works for a state agency, the Department of Public Safety, doing analytical work. Sounds like what you do. Is that what you were doing?
Yes, they're very comparable.
Right. So you're doing work for the state agency, considering evidence that's been submitted to you for purposes of identification or whatever's necessary. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
You have to reach certain standards of competency in order to perform that state job?
Yes. So there's two basically levels here. There's the accreditation level. So that's an external agency that comes in and does an audit of the crime laboratory itself and checks its policies and procedures and checks some cherry-picked cases to make sure that the cases are worked in accordance with the policies that were written. And so they establish a level of quality that must be met within an individual's casework and their performance. In addition to that, in the firearms field, again, AFTI has a set of guidelines. They set out a training manual that consists of several training assignments and practical exercises. And you must successfully complete those and undergo tests and mock trials along the way to verify that you have retained that information and you can perform the duties necessary. And so all of that together, what we like to say is that roughly 2-year on-the-job training program will train everybody uniformly to competency. And then that competency each year is tested through what's called proficiency tested. Another external agency sends in a test with evidence. Nobody at the crime laboratory knows what the answer is. So in that respect, it's what's called a blind test. And you will work it just like it was a regular case, send it back to them with the results, and they will let you know if you got it right or wrong. If you get it right, that competency is demonstrated, you're still proficient in your job. If you were to get it incorrect, there would be some remedial training. You would go back in and have to do that and to catch back up.
All right, so you passed all that stuff, qualified, and were able to perform your job. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, at TBI, when you were working for the state before you went into private practice, is there a protocol in terms of having your results verified?
Yes, so there is a procedure in place. Basically, whenever you are working a case, when you are finished with it and you have reached your conclusion, you will hand that off to a second. It has to be another qualified examiner that's actively doing casework as well. You'll hand it off to them, and they will then take the evidence from you, look at it themselves on this microscope, so basically reworking it for them without having to do all the paperwork that's associated with it. And then they will reach their conclusion, and you will come back together, and if the conclusion is the same, it's written, the report's released.
Do you estimate for the jury how much or how many types of examinations you may have dealt with during your employment at TBI, which was for how many years, sir?
So I was employed with the Bureau for close to 9 years.
Ballpark for us, how many identifications similar to the type of work you're doing here today for us?
So I couldn't break it down into identifications versus not.
Not the result, but just the process.
Sure. To go through this whole process, when I left, it was in excess of 1,300 cases, which consisted of multiple thousands of bullets and cartridge cases that I had compared together.
Right. And when you have the requirement to do so, all of that being verified, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
So, are you a member of any associations that are pertinent other than AFTI to your work, sir?
Sure. So, like you mentioned, in addition to AFTI, I'm also a member of OSAC, which is the Organization of Scientific Area Committees. This is an international group It's started by NIST, which is the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and it's basically bringing together experts, practitioners in the field such as myself, as well as corporations that build or work on the software or the equipment that we use. It also includes members of academia that are doing research in the field. And so we come together as this committee, and we will develop and propose and advocate for the best practices and the policies and procedures to be implemented in crime laboratories across the states.
All right, so let me break it down this way. There are doers, and then there are people that are setting standards and working to advance the practice. Is that right?
Yes, that's two classes.
You do both. Is that fair?
Yes, that would be fair to say.
Work within the industry, and you're also working to better the industry and strengthen its requirements. Is that fair?
Yes, that is correct.
Tell us a little bit about, in addition to the professional organizations, do you teach, do you mentor? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So there are a couple more organizations. The International Ammunition Association, I'm also a member of. The the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction as well. But then I recently started an adjunct faculty position at a small liberal arts college near where I live, where I have helped them develop and get approved the forensic science degree. And so I will be teaching that starting next year, starting with a basic introduction to forensic science and then building from that with advanced topics and various issues in forensic science. When I was with the Bureau, and also I continue now, I taught multiple classes to investigators and detectives on how to recognize firearms evidence, how to properly collect and preserve that type of evidence. It routinely also included me basically giving a demonstration of how a forensic firearms examiner like myself would work a case so that they would know when you brought in evidence, here's the process it'll go through. I taught multiple courses for the Bureau as well in line with this. And then I was the training officer for another special agent in our unit. That was the most recent addition right before I left.
Let me ask you about, and I want to get through this and get to the substance, but I just want to make sure it's clear. In addition to what you've already told us about what you do and the organizations you're involved with, do you research, publish, present in areas related to your expertise?
Yes, I do all of the above.
Tell me a little bit about research publications that have been peer-reviewed and what peer review means.
Sure. So with AFD, I'm actually also one of the assistant editors, so I'm heavily involved in that peer review process. And what that entails, basically, let's say you go out and you decide there's a question that you want answered, and you do some experimentation to answer that question. You would write that up and submit it to the journal that you choose to be published in, and it would go to an editorial panel or a committee of other experts in that same field. They will then read your paper, review it, point out any weaknesses in it, and make suggestions for strengthening the paper, for strengthening the conclusions, the scientific validity of those conclusions. Send it back to the person that would be submitting it for those revisions to occur. After that, they would then resubmit it back, and ultimately through this back and forth process, these peers that are the professionals, experts in the community as well, will either ultimately sign off and say it's good for publication, or they will reject it and say, no, it's, there's too much more work that needs to be done. And so that's the peer review process. And I've published multiple papers over the years since I've been in the forensic science field in multiple peer-reviewed publications.
Just give us a ballpark number if you can shorten it down for us. Just ballpark, how many times have you presented on the topics of ballistics and those kinds of things?
Maybe 20 or 30 times.
I want to talk a little bit more about, in going through qualifications, talk a little bit about training and how you update that and what training is composed of these days.
Sure. So the first part is that 2-year on-the-job training program, roughly, that I mentioned earlier. So that's going to consist of reading textbook materials, journal articles on the history, the manufacturing, and the examination of firearms and ammunition components. It will also include visiting multiple firearm and ammunition manufacturers to see the types of tools and the types of methods that are used when these items are being made, so you can better understand where the marks that you'll be looking at on a microscope, where they come from. It also includes working cases alongside several court-qualified examiners, and in my case, they had over 100 years of combined experience when I was going through that training. So after that initial process and you are signed off as an examiner, there's continuing education. So I try to go to at least one conference a year. COVID has made that hard, but there's also a lot of webinars now, and so we can attend those. In addition, just off the top of my head, I've done the alphabet soup of government agency training, so the ATF, the FBI, TBI, all of their different trainings relevant in the field. They can last anywhere from 2 days to a week. I've done training at a few different universities as well that have forensic programs, such as West Virginia University, the University of North Dakota. Of course, the AFTI meetings are the big one. That's the most pertinent to the field. And then webinars are by various customers, other experts in our field that put on classes, and commercial manufacturers of the equipment that we use. They'll put on webinars as well.
We heard earlier from another expert about doing factory tours, laboratory tours. Has that been part of something that you've done as well?
Yes, that has been.
Why is that important?
So as I mentioned, when you're looking at something on a microscope and you're looking at these marks, which we call striations, I'll call them scratches today, you want to be able to understand exactly how those scratches arrived and what exactly their significance is with what you're looking at. And so going to the firearms and ammunition manufacturers, seeing the plant, getting kind of behind the scenes tours, if you will, it really helps you understand exactly what those processes are, what those tools actually look like, and how they can lead to the types of marks that you see kind of two places removed.
Is it, maybe it's a too general a way to put it, but sounds like what you're here talking about today is your thing. Is this your thing? Is this what you do?
Yes, that you could put it that way.
All right, I don't know if you've done it down that way, but let's talk a little bit about your connection involvement in this case. Did you get contacted by the defense in this case to potentially work as an expert and analyze certain material?
Yes, I did.
And were you given what you needed to be able to do your thing?
Yes, I was.
And as a result of that, did you prepare a presentation for us that will help you not only show us what you do, but what you specifically did in this case to reach the decision that you did?
Yes, I did.
If I called that your PowerPoint, would that be a fair way to refer to it?
It would be.
If I can... and I'd like permission to proceed with PowerPoint.
Do we just, I'm going to ask him to admit it, just show it to the jury? Is that
No,
what?
I'm going to have narrated, much similar to what we did with another witness previously.
Right, so you want to use it as, right now you just want to be able to publish it and utilize it.
That's correct.
Any objection, Mr.
No
Barker?
objection, thank
All
you.
right, you may do so.
If we could dim the lights just a little bit.
So I don't know if it's,
I am.
So, by way of background, in your world, is it important to be able to explain your topic to a jury in order to gain some understanding?
Absolutely, yes.
And is this process, what we're doing today, foreign to you? Have you appeared in other courts to educate jurors about this topic?
Yes, I have.
If we called that expert testimony, how many times have you done that?
It's somewhere in excess of 50.
Other states, federal courts, things like that.
Yes, that is correct.
And I want, in doing what you do, is it important to be able to not only explain the process, but show the actual work product that you relied on to come to your conclusion?
Definitely to show the process, and it can be important as well to show the work product. Every case is unique, and it really depends.
Is it the standard in your industry, sir, that an expert should be able to not only give an answer, but show the reason.
Yes, and the policies through the accreditation process, I believe it's 7.5.1.3, says that our casework has to actually be able to, in our absence, for another person to come along and be able to see what we did and repeat those same experiments and arrive at the same conclusion.
So you were starting with your PowerPoint. You indicated in the first slide a microscopic bullet comparison. Could you tell us why this illustration is helpful to just understand the process?
Yes, so what I have illustrated are two objects. One, which I hope is obvious, is a barrel of a firearm, and it's got a nice little hole in it in this illustration to show you what's inside of the barrel, and that's what's called the rifling. So that's a series of raised and lowered impressions that spiral inside of the barrel, kind of like the stripes on the candy cane or on a barber pole. And so they will either twist to the right or the left. And then on the right, what I'm showing, hopefully this is also not foreign, is my illustration of a bullet to the best of my ability. I'm not an artist, but what I'm showing here is basically my rendition of a lead bullet, so it's gray. And these darker gray areas would represent the impressions that are picked up from the rifling as that bullet travels down the barrel.
So I guess just big picture purposes, why are twists and lands and grooves and markings in barrels, why are they in there?
Sure. So what we're talking about right now would be what's called the class characteristics of a firearm, specifically of the barrel of that firearm. So that's how many of those raised and lowered portions are there, how many of those lands and grooves is what they're called, are there, and do they twist to the right or the left? And they are there so that as the bullet is basically forced into the barrel because of all the burning gunpowder that's behind it, producing smoke, which produces pressure, all that pressure serves to push that bullet into the barrel and down it downrange. And as that happens, the bullet, fancy word, obturates. So what that means is it swells, basically. The pressure behind it will cause it to flare and spread and fill in all the gaps and crevices so that gas cannot escape past the bullet. And it will then engage that rifling, and the rifling, because it twists, causes the bullet to take and assume that same twist, so that when the bullet leaves the barrel, it is spinning, much like a quarterback has to get a good spiral when they throw the football. And this will impart accuracy in the flight of that bullet or projectile.
Is that a new phenomenon? Has that been in barrels of guns for tens of years? How back does that go?
Rifling is back the 17th century, I believe it was, the mid-1600s.
So go to the next slide, if you will. So talk a little bit about what you're representing to us now.
Sure. So in the course of an examination of bullets, a lot of times what we will do is we will, and what I did in this case, is index the bullet or index the bullets. And what I mean by that is basically taking a Sharpie, and as you mount the bullet on the microscope, you'll roll the bullet or rotate it around and look at all 360 degrees, the full surface of that basically cylinder or that projectile. And you're looking at all the rifling marks, all the different marks that are imparted on that bullet from the inside of that barrel. And we will find areas that have very obvious features on it, and index those so that at any point in time we can go back and find that index and lock into that area and then continue to rotate from that point forward. So it basically gives us a reference point as to where to start.
You use different colors to show where you are in the rotation?
Yes, you can. So if, let's say there are multiple areas that you like, or bullets may mark a little bit differently if you've got different material that the bullets are made out of. You can use different colors to highlight, different things and basically help orient yourself in a very quick manner. And it also gives you a reference point when you're referring back to a bullet to say, oh, this is the agreement or the difference or what, these are the features that I saw at this specific location. So that index plus or minus however many land impressions.
Forward, please.
So what I'm illustrating here is basically if you can imagine this is in 3 dimensions, and you want to.
I don't know. See.
Right, I'm not sure if they can see the screen. Oh, because you're at the podium, so can we? Yes, you can move it wherever you want. Thank you for letting us know. Can you see now? Great. Can everybody see? Great, nods of the heads. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Griffin.
Continue.
So if you can imagine that this is a bullet in 3 dimensions, and I'm looking at it on the microscope to take a photograph of it, what I'm basically doing is turning that 3-dimensional object into a flat 2-dimensional photograph. And so that's what I'm basically illustrating here. You can only see maybe 3 and a partial fourth of a land impression with that index. But in a photograph, or as I'm rolling it around on the microscope, I could maybe able to photograph, I can show you more through multiple photographs and walk you around the whole bullet.
We're going to see the photographs you took, but shortly, in short order. But basically, you're telling us how you're going, what you're doing, and what you're going to show us.
I'm explaining and orienting you so you know when you do see the photographs what you're looking at. And so, as I mentioned earlier, on the microscope, you can rotate that bullet around. And so what I'm illustrating here is if you were to take and rotate what I would call the plus orientation. So in this case, this would be the purple index. If I rotate away from me so that this next one is coming to the top, because again, I'm on 3 dimensions on the microscope, that would be the purple index plus 1. So that's what I mean when I say that. So I'm going to illustrate that here. So as I rotate in that direction, I'm revealing more of what was behind the bullet now and showing more and more of the land impressions that are past that. So purple index plus 1, purple index plus 2, plus 3, and so on. So we rotate it again. And that's basically what I would be doing. And so when we are examining, and when I examine the bullet in this case, I use a specialized instrument called a comparison microscope. It's a fancy microscope. It's basically 2 microscopes that are joined together. So this is the model that I have. And so there's one microscope here that I've labeled number 2, and one right here that I've labeled number 1. But they're joined together by what's called an optical bridge. So when I look through these eyepieces, I actually see both sides at the same time. And I can, by using and manipulating this optical bridge, I can show both of them overlapped. I can show just one side, just the other side, or both of them together. And when I bring the 2 together, but not overlapped, what occurs is in my photograph, there's a dividing line. I've got it illustrated here in black because that's the actual color that it is on the microscope. In the photographs I took of the examination of the evidence, I've added a red line on it just because it gets hard to see, as you'll observe. But basically what this is illustrating is that on the left-hand side, we're looking at a portion of the bullet under microscope 1, also on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is what would be under microscope number 2. So I'm seeing them both at the same time. And I'm bringing them together at that dividing line, and I'm looking at the features on those bullets to see if they line up. Now, I want to emphasize here with this slide, so there's 2 different types of characteristics or features that we look for. The first is class characteristics. Class characteristics do not tell you which gun specifically fired the item in question. Class characteristics help you restrict or narrow down your list of possibilities. So if there is no match at the class characteristic level, then you automatically know it's not the gun in question. The 2 items that you're looking at don't match. If the class characteristics do match, then you can move forward to look at the individual characteristics. And the way I like to illustrate or talk about this is if you're coming out of the mall or out of the grocery store into a big parking lot and you're looking for your car, you likely unconsciously are looking for class characteristics of your car. So you know it's a blue SUV. So you don't have to spend any time looking at all the cars, the sedans, the convertibles, because you know that's not yours. And then you get to where you think you parked, and it's an SUV. So that class characteristic matches. The color, it matches. It's got 4 wheels, it matches. Maybe your Ford Explorer has, that particular model. I don't have a Ford Explorer, so I'm just using this as an example, but assuming that they have roof racks. So if one of those class characteristics that would be common to all Ford Explorers is not there, then you know it's not your car. But if they all are there, then you look for the individual characteristics. And that's your work parking hang tag from your rearview mirror. That's your vanity plate that you got. That's the dent in your quarter panel where the last time you were in the grocery store, somebody let their cart run into your car. These are all things that are, as a whole, unique to your car alone. And that's how maybe you click your key fob and the car beeps. Those are all your clues that this is your car. You can get in it and drive home. And so when it comes to a bullet comparison, I'm looking past the class characteristics, which are, the light stripes and the big dark stripes. Those are class. I'm looking inside of those stripes at the fine scratches. These are those individual characteristics that I also call the mechanical fingerprint of that firearm. And so if what I'm showing here, in the case of 2 test fires, where I've got both of them indexed together, this would be what's called the 2 test fires being in phase. So I would want those 2 indexes to line up, and then I would rotate them together all the way around. Now let's say it's something like this, where they're out of phase. You can still see that even though these 2 test fires from the same gun, there might be 1, 2, 3, some sporadic lines or scratches that happen to match up, but the vast majority of them are quite different. And so in this case, if they're 2 test fires that you shot from the same gun, you don't have them in the right phase yet. So you'll keep one stationary at your index, the area that you like, and you'll rotate the other one and look at one after the next until you start to see that agreement. Once you find that, and it looks like that again, then you rotate them together. And you're looking at this point at your index where they match, they look good together, you rotate. Do they still look good? Yes. Okay, rotate again. Do they still look good? Yes. And you can see I've illustrated here, there may even be a little difference. But at the end of the day, the vast majority of all these individual characteristics, they match up. So that would be what either, if it's a known to an unknown, that would be a match or an identification. If it's a test fire to test fire, that would be what I would call that those 2 test fires are now in phase. Going back to this would be 2 test fires that are out of phase, or something where we would say this is a non-match, because as I go around from here to here to here, nothing is matching up. Or maybe I find 1 or 2 things that 1 or 2 scratches that match up. But in general, there's no correlation there.
Next.
So now we're getting to the actual evidence photos that I took on my microscope. And each slide I'm going to kind of orient you. On the left-hand side is what I'm calling my second test fire from the Marlin rifle in question. And on the right side of this red line is my 3rd test fire. Now,
They're asking, why would you compare test fires? What's the point of doing that if you know you shot it out of the same gun?
yeah. So from one test to the next, a gun can still mark slightly differently. So there's multiple reasons to do multiple test fires. So the kind of, I would say the industry standard is a bare minimum of 2 test fires. Most people will test fire 3 times. If you don't know the exact type of ammunition, the evidence, bullet or cartridge case that you've got, you will potentially fire more than 3, multiple of different types of brands to try and as closely compare apples to apples as you can. And so in this case, I think I fired 11 different test fires over the course of a few days. But the reason you look at those test fires together, and you typically want to do that before you look at the evidence, is to get that idea of what that mechanical fingerprint looks like of that gun. So you're getting in your mind's eye what the type of striations and agreement you see for that specific gun with that specific ammunition combination. And so again, this would be at my black index. So that's what I'm illustrating up here at the top. That black index is right here where we're looking. And I will say typically, it's not common to show photographs from a microscope like this. Usually the reasoning is because of the almost 24 months that we spent looking at all these different combinations of bullets that came from the same gun or different guns. I felt it was pertinent in this case because of the drastic difference between what I saw with test fires and what I saw with the evidence, and I'll show that as we move forward. But what I'm wanting to just point out here is, again, we're not looking at the fact that this groove impression is the same width, or that this land impression is the same width. These are all those class characteristics. What I'm looking at are the fine lines right here inside of this land impression. And so what I'm illustrating with the photograph is just the agreement that you see these scratches carry from this side over to this side, from this side over to this side, much like the illustration I showed of that cartoon from earlier. So I'm going to rotate the bullet away, so going in the positive direction. And so now we're at the black index +1, so the one right below that in this illustration. And again, we're not looking at the big similarities, but again, you can still see right there at the black index, those scratches are lining up. And same thing here, maybe there's a wider scratch right next to another wider scratch, and then a fine scratch down there. So what I'm illustrating is this is the type of agreement that I'm seeing with this gun, the Marlin rifle in question, and the test fires that I created. So I know I fired it. I know these bullets came from the barrel of that gun. And this is the level of agreement that I'm seeing. So I'll rotate around again. So now we're the third land impression down, and there were 16 of these, so I'm not going to torture everybody looking at a lot of different photographs. I'm going to just point out again, you see scratches that match here. So now if I go to look at my test fires compared to the test fires that were provided to me from the Arizona DPS.
Stop you right there. So, just to make sure for the jury's benefit, when you do your thing and you're looking at this, you receive materials that were previously generated by the state lab. Is that fair?
Yes, that is correct.
Is that what happened here?
Yes, it is.
Go ahead and explain as you walk through.
Sure. So I initially approached this case as if it had never been worked before. So I'm generating all my own test fires. I'm examining the rifle, making sure that it's safe to fire, making sure that there's no modifications or anything that might make it unsafe to fire. I check how much force it takes to pull the trigger. I take measurements and take photographs of the firearm, and then I test fire it, and I generate my tests. And then I compare those tests like I just showed. And because I was submitted Arizona's test fires, I then also looked at those to make sure that mine matched up with theirs, as they should, because what I was told was that these were test fires from that Marlin rifle as well. And so that's what I did. And again, going back to the black index, which I've got another green dot up here, because maybe you can faintly see there, it's right next to the green index that was previously placed on that bullet, not by me. And so again, what I'm illustrating is there's some scratches that go from my test fire onto their test fire and match up. These things line up inside of that land impression. And so I'm going to do the same thing and walk you around this bullet. So if we rotate back to +1, again, you see lots of nice agreement right there, as I would expect, because these are test fires from the same rifle.
Counsel, I'm sorry. Did you finish? Were you going to say something else? I apologize.
I can keep.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Sorry. Finish what you were saying. I thought you had stopped. Sorry.
So I rotated it around again, and now we're the +2. And again, you see agreement carry over from the right to the left. And then rotate around several more times to, in this case, +15. So basically, we're now looking at the one right of, we've gone all the way around the bullet, and we're looking at the one right above the black index. And again, you see some nice agreement there, carrying from one side to the next.
I'm just going to want to talk to us. Are we at a point where we're about to go take a look at the evidence bullet and what you did? In other words, I'm looking for a place where we can just take a moment to stop.
This works. This is fine.
I think you wanted to address it.
I want to address because it's 4:01. So, and I didn't mean to interrupt. I apologize. I stopped you.
It's okay.
So I'm so sorry. Counsel, will you approach? nice. Do not let anyone talk to you about it. It includes each other. Please keep an open mind about the case, and please do not formulate any opinions about the case. So please be back in the jury room by 8:45 tomorrow morning, so that that way everyone hopefully can be ready and we can call for you as close to 9 as possible, as we try to do every day. All right, so we stand in recess.